It's my honor to introduce our first speaker. Eleanor Roosevelt was the longest-serving First Lady in United States history, serving from 1933 until 1945. But her story did not end with her husband Franklin's death. Less than a year after she moved out of the White House, Eleanor stepped into the most thrilling and rewarding time of her life. From chairing the Human Rights Commission in the first years of the United Nations, to writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to touring the world and having a one-on-one with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Eleanor Roosevelt truly owned the title that President Harry Truman gave her, First Lady of the World. Our Chautauqua finds Eleanor at 77 years old in the year 1961. She'd just recently been appointed chair of President Kennedy's Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. She will reflect on her own development and growth as a leader throughout her life and on the years since her husband's death. The advent of the nuclear age, communism, and the response to it, and what every single person can do in their lives to promote world peace and goodwill toward all people. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Eleanor Roosevelt.
Good afternoon. You know, for the first time in my memory, I find myself in the unique position that it has been some time since the last time I've left Hyde Park. Previous, I've always been so busy that I've never had time at home. And I can tell you, I don't like it very much. But when they asked me here today, I couldn't resist venturing out to meet you all. That isn't to say I haven't had a constant flow of visitors. Why, just last week, I was visited at Valkill, my personal cottage on the Hyde Park grounds, by that very nice young man, our new president, Mr. Kennedy. We had a lovely conversation about his initiative to incorporate a new organization, the Peace Corps. It is a program to encourage and facilitate international service by sending our nation's young people out into the world, and especially into developing nations, to spread education, improve the quality of life. Let the struggling people of the world know that they are not alone, and especially positively impact global progress overall. Mr. Kennedy, while he visited me, also asked me to chair his Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, an initiative to educate the government on the many issues facing women in America today, and encourage the politicians in Washington to remove the barriers that face the American women. Specifically, we are working on trying to get women into positions of national security and diplomacy. We feel that the idea being America needs all of its citizens to make the most positive impact in the world. Now, when one reaches a certain age, they begin to consider many things that they never thought about in their life before, such as how they will be remembered after they are gone. Now, most people, if they are lucky, have the most important privilege of considering how their loved ones, the friends and family they're leaving behind, will remember them. But a select few have the privilege of considering how their country and how their world will remember them. I find myself among that few. I suppose future generations will remember me as the niece of one great president and the wife of another. And perhaps that is as it should be, because both my Uncle Ted and Franklin were extraordinary men who led this country in the right direction. But I have tried to make my own independent mark on the world. I have, in one way or another, for many years now, lived and breathed public service. If you had asked me when I was a young girl if this is what I had imagined myself doing for most of my life, you might have been laughed at. I would have said that you had quite the imagination. I would have said that I was going to live an unimportant and uneventful life, probably as someone's maiden aunt. Others in my life, throughout my life, had other plans. The first person who really made a significant impact in my life and in pushing me to find direction and find purpose was the headmistress of Allenswood School for Girls. Unfortunately, when I was very young, before I reached adolescence, both my mother and father passed away. And my grandmama didn't quite know what to do with me. So she sent me away, all the way across the Atlantic, to the Allenswood School for Girls, which is located outside London. And I was under the instruction of Madame Marie Silvestre, who was the headmistress. She taught only in French, and the students spoke only in French. She taught me about the social injustices that exist in the world and encouraged me to stand up for others in any way that I can and find a voice through what she called my écriture fantastique, that is, my fantastic writing. When I returned to the States after my time at Allenswood, it was with a greater social conscience and a mild awareness of the inequalities and injustices facing women in this country. Soon after that, I began to be courted by my distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of the Hyde Park Delanos. It's funny. People always ask me how exactly we are related and make such an ordeal over the fact that we were cousins. But Franklin and I, one day, early in our relationship, sat down and drew up a family tree. And for the life of us, we don't know how we're related either. We are either fifth cousins 6 times removed, or sixth cousins 5 times removed. Oh well, that's neither here nor there. When Franklin was courting me, we used to go on long walks and talk on a wide variety of stimulating intellectual subjects. We talked about history and philosophy, about literature and politics. If, as they say, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, the way to a woman's must be through her mind. When he proposed to me in 1903, he gave me a very logical reason as to why I should marry him. He said, "Well, Eleanor, if you marry me, you will not have to change your stationery or your luggage, because everything will still say Eleanor Roosevelt." We married on St. Patrick's Day in 1905, where I was walked down the aisle by then President, my uncle Theodore Roosevelt. At the ceremony, there was a moment when Theodore stepped into the study to take care of business, and the entire guest, all of the guests in attendance, followed him in there. So you could say that at our own wedding, we were a little overshadowed. Now, anyone who ever knew Franklin would have told you that they had a feeling that he was meant for a life of significance. Even when he was a boy, there was this aura about him, that he was destined for greatness and was going to accomplish highly important things. Whether I liked it or not, and then it was not, I knew when I married him that my life would somehow become more important by association. This proved well on its way to being true when in 1913, President Wilson appointed him the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But it was the summer of 1921 that changed our lives forever. We were vacationing with the children at our vacation home in Campobello when Franklin became stricken with illness. At first, I thought it was nothing more than the common influenza and treated it as so. But then he told me that he lost all feeling in his legs. After several doctor's visits, they diagnosed him as having polio. At that time in his life, Franklin fell into a deep depression, for it seemed that all Franklin's future held was being cared for by his mother at Hyde Park as nothing more than a common invalid. But, as you probably know, that wasn't meant to be. Both his campaign manager, Hale, and I were very concerned for his mental well-being. We made a pact between the two of us that we would do everything in our power to see to it that Franklin could live up to his potential and be every bit as significant as he was always meant to be, despite the polio. Now, I feel that I must say that when I first knew Hale, I didn't care for him at all. Rest his soul. He was loud, obnoxious, he constantly smoked and drank, he was a heavy gambler, and between you and me, he had a rather unpleasant odor. But my opinion changed of the man in 1921. Once I saw how much Louis loved Franklin and wanted him to have happiness and success, we became lifelong allies, Louis and I. We decided to make sure Franklin had the life he wanted. I would take an active and perhaps unorthodox role in the campaign trail. I would travel the state and eventually the country and campaign on Franklin's behalf. Louis and I succeeded in getting Franklin into the governorship of New York in 1928 and into the presidency of the United States in 1932. Once he realized that his dreams were still possible, Franklin became his old self with a grand enthusiasm for life and a deeply rooted value of helping the less fortunate. Once in the White House, I became a champion for my husband's New Deal policies, giving speeches across the nation in favor of helping the average American survive the Great Depression that we were in. I also started a daily column in 1936 that continues to this day, giving my opinion on a wide variety of subjects. When we entered the war in 1941, and the nation's focus shifted from domestic to foreign affairs, I became the president's eyes and ears around the world. I spearheaded movements at home and abroad to get our nation's women and girls involved in the war effort. I advocated for women to enter the workforce and make up for the industry lost by having so many of our nation's young men overseas. I visited our troops across the Pacific, often finding myself the only woman on any given island that I was on. I met with foreign leaders, unwilling or unable to visit Washington, and relayed messages from Franklin and then reported back to him. We rarely saw each other during those last years. Now, I vividly remember that April morning that Franklin died in 1945. As soon as I heard he'd passed, I sent for Vice President Truman to meet me at the White House. I took him into my study and told him the news. I remember him expressing the deepest condolences and asking if there was anything he could do for me. I looked him in the eye, gave him the smallest of smiles, and said, "No, Harry. Is there anything I can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." The following day, after traveling to Georgia to see my president's body, for he died in our resort in Warm Springs, when I was traveling back on the train to Washington with my husband's body on the train, I remembered a young reporter visiting me in my car to offer his condolences. He asked me what was next in store for me. He expressed that he didn't believe my story was over. I told him that nothing was in store for me, that I would probably fade into obscurity, that the story was over. That very same young man visited me at Hyde Park not too long ago and I was forced to eat my words. Unbeknownst to me, my story did not end with my husband's death. Following Franklin's death, President Truman and I kept a steady correspondence with each other. He asked my opinion on all matters of policy. In December of 1945, Mr. Truman told me of his intention to appoint me a United States delegate to the first session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, taking place in London in the following month. After much contemplation, I agreed to serve my country and my president and attend what I felt for sure was a one-time matter of symbolic gesture, Franklin having had such a grand part and a significant role in the initial planning of the United Nations. But when President Truman learned of the work I contributed in my time in the Third Committee, the Committee on Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Affairs, he made the decision to appoint me to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and the other commission members made me the chair. It was there that I pursued the most personally rewarding and proud work of my life. Our primary objective was to compose a universal Declaration of Human Rights, a Magna Carta for all mankind. We took the principles of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and our nation's Bill of Rights, and especially the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and applied it to every single person across the world in all nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the General Assembly by the United Nations on December 10th, 1948. And from now on, December 10th will always be Human Rights Day. I believe that the single most important thing we can do to perpetuate peace in this world is to increase understanding for one another worldwide and recognize that we are all, every human being on this planet, is inherently and innately equal, and as such, all deserve to be treated with equal human dignity. Everyone benefits when we choose to act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, belief, and yes, even difference of opinion. It is okay to believe differently than somebody else, as long as you recognize their inalienable right to believe differently as well. It is our differences, after all, that make this world we share beautiful, fascinating, and bountiful in knowledge and experiences. For these deeply held beliefs of mine, and for several other reasons, I have been harshly criticized over the years. I remember one time, back when I was First Lady, before the United States had entered the war, when we had the King and Queen of England visit us at Hyde Park. Well, they told me to serve an authentically American cuisine. So I served hot dogs. What better way to introduce them to American food? Well, some people didn't think that was very proper. I have been heavily criticized and scrutinized over the years indeed. I am well aware that Mr. Hoover, over at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, has quite an extensive file on me. But make no mistake, despite what Mr. Hoover and several other people who think like him might think, I am not, nor have I ever been, a communist sympathizer. I simply do not believe in the kind of stringent anti-communist radicalism that infringes on the human rights of anyone. I do not believe we should be governed in an atmosphere of constant fear and rampant paranoia that has us, people in America, craning over our neighbors' garden fences and spying on our neighbors in the highly unlikely and improbable event that they might be Soviet plants sent to bring down the United States government. Nor do I believe that preemptive military action against the Soviets is the answer. Believe me, I am well aware from my time at the United Nations to the barriers to communicating effectively with the Soviet representation. However, I maintain that patience and constant pursuit of greater levels of understanding is the answer to resolving this Cold War that we find ourselves in. Only through personal diplomacy can we hope to build a stronger and safer world. In the past 8 years since my time at the United Nations came to an end, my life has barely slowed at all. Starting in 1953, I took a series of trips around the world. I visited Japan and stood at the epicenter of the devastation in Hiroshima. That was an incredible eye-opener to the mass destruction and devastation we now have the capability of inflicting on one another. I then visited Hong Kong and stood at the border of communist China. I visited the police state of Yugoslavia and met with Marshal Tito. In the elections of 1952 and 1956, I heavily campaigned for Governor Adlai Stevenson's bid for president. I believed greatly that he would do a much better job than President Eisenhower was doing and place a greater emphasis on diplomacy and less of an emphasis on fear. In 1957, I made a trip that I had wanted to take for quite some time. I made my first visit to Soviet Russia. During this trip, I took a hard look at the communist infrastructure to the fields of medicine, science, education, and farming. I learned that in 1956, just the year prior, Soviet schools graduated over 26,000 doctors, while the U.S., we graduated only 6,500. During this trip, I met with Premier Nikita Khrushchev. in Yalta. We had a 3-hour-long conversation over tea discussing the principles of communism and democracy. Mr. Khrushchev made it clear that he believed the entire world would accept communism in his lifetime. I let him know that I adamantly disagreed with him. People asked me if I was scared at this meeting. I must confess I was petrified. But courage is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to do the right thing, regardless of how afraid you are. When Mr. Khrushchev came to America this year, he stopped by and paid me a brief visit at Hyde Park. The bottom line is the United States cannot build a peaceful world alone. It is only through collaboration and compromise that we will harvest an atmosphere of security, peace, and mutual prosperity. I know that my chapter in history will soon come to a close, as all of ours must at one point or another. But the chapter of America, the chapter of humanity, and the chapter of the pursuit of human rights continues on. There is no end in sight. To all in the journey forward, I encourage deeply rooted human understanding and respect for one another, cultural awareness, the pursuit of knowledge, and the recognition of the innate equality of all members of the human family. Thank you.